Hello. So, in this video, we are going to be covering the relations, expressions, and equations, sort of what makes them different and what their uses are. So, to start with, right, our relations, expressions, equations. So, the first bit, we have the relation. So, sort of a nice English equivalent would be relation, sort of the verb in math. So, we have this sort of definition, any kind of link between information or variables. It's very general. It's just sort of like how verb is very general. So when you think of relation, you want to think of operations like adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, things like that. Okay? Expressions then are sort of like the phrases of math. They're how you sort of put together some pieces of information with the relation, but they don't actually have anything beyond that, right? They don't have any of those equalities or inequalities to form the next step, the equations. So an equation would be sort of like the equivalent to a sentence, right? So it has each of those sort of previous pieces. It has a relation, it has the expression, and it puts it together with an equality or an inequality to make this sort of representation, this sort of self-contained piece. We can see, right, moving forward, that if we're looking at expressions and relations, expressions and equations, they're both relations, right? So this is the sort of key thing to keep in mind, is that these relations are sort of the framework piece that build up. But the thing with an equation, just like a sentence, is that it doesn't necessarily have context, right? So when we look at this equation that we have down here, right, this a squared plus b squared equals c squared, you might think of a triangle, right? The classic Pythagorean theorem. But strictly speaking, this equation doesn't necessarily have anything to do with that triangle. It's just an equation I gave you. It might have something to do with something completely different, or I might have just picked things at random. The point is that there's nothing telling you here that has anything to do with a triangle, right? So that's what sort of makes it different than the next thing we're going to look at, which are functions, okay? So equations are just the relationship. They are not any sort of contextual piece. So functions have sort of additional properties on top of this. So they're equations, but they have a few other things. In particular, one of the sort of key things that is hammered into you, I'm sure, probably even by this point from back in the day, is that each input has exactly one output. And this is sort of key in two different ways. One, each input has to have an output. You can't just not have an answer. But sort of more importantly, and the one that we sort of run into a lot, is that it can only have one output. There's a very specific output for any given input. The part that we don't usually harp on as much, but turns out to be just as important, is that part that we talked about a second ago, which is that functions have context. Okay, so this is usually in sort of the math setting given by looking at the domain and the codomain. So the domain, that's the thing that has the independent variables, right? The sort of input piece, and the codomain is the dependent variable, the output piece, okay? But the important thing is it has context. It's that sort of triangle visual that you have when you look at the equation, okay? So functions then are capturing this sort of big picture idea. So this property part that we talked about seems sort of artificial, right? It's just some math thing, but it turns out that this occurs in the real world all the time. So for example, you might look at things like trying to send credit card information, right? So you might want to encrypt a credit card. You need to make sure that a given credit card gets sent to only one encryption so that you can sort of decrypt it on the other side, right? If you're looking at profit, right, you want to be able to put in some information and figure out exactly what the profit of your company is, because otherwise you have no idea what the actual profit ends up being, right? It could be like 5 or 10. Well, those are very different numbers. We need to know which one, right? So in practice, actually, this one output per input thing is sort of almost always the case going to be something you need anyway. So it turns out to be very natural in the real world, okay? So in this sort of video, we covered basically terminology, but we covered that relation, expression, equation, right? The relation is sort of the verb. The expression is sort of that sort of phrase bit, right? Just some stuff that's sort of related together, but without any sort of equality or inequality. And the equation is that sort of sentence, but without context, right? So it's just sort of standing alone without any sort of bigger idea behind it. And then functions are basically equations which have that bigger context, which we achieve through domain, codomain, and we sort of require this natural property of that exactly one output per input. Okay, so that's that.